Hello everyone and welcome to Mythology Matters with James Portnow. Is that what we're really calling it?
Yes!
First off, I just want to thank all of the patrons out there. We couldn't do this series without you. We've wanted to do it forever, and your contribution is what makes this even possible. So thank you so much. Now, let's get this thing started. I just want to come on live and take a minute to talk to you guys about why myths matter, what we can get from these myths we're talking about, and of course, some of the wacky, weird stuff that's going on. As far as why myths matter, I just thought we need to kick off the show by talking about the fact that myths are more than just stories. They're the basis of our culture. They're the place where a lot of our ideas about ourselves come from. They're also an explanation. And many of you have probably heard that this is myths were a way for early societies to explain things to themselves, often about the natural world, things like earthquakes or lightning. But they're also more than that. They're also a way for us to understand ourselves. They're a way for cultures to explain parts of the human psyche in a way that they didn't necessarily have the vocabulary for. And especially when we look at these myths and we see things that are recurring themes that come up again and again and again, parallels like Izanami and Persephone. When we see those parallels across cultures, across different parts of the world that never communicated, we know that there's something there that's very fundamental, very human that it's discussing. For example, take the Norse myths that we did a couple of months back and the Celtic myths we just covered, right? Both these are origin stories, but what are they both? They're both these establishment stories, right? They're this idea of coming in and there's this other in the place you want to be, and there's this great war with the other, and at first you're fighting it and you're establishing yourself, and then you can sort of come to find a truce with and sort of become one with and even integrate parts of this other society, this other culture, this other people. And what that really represents is this need in us for that sort of establishment, right? We're all born, we're children, we're in the world of other people, and we haven't established who we are. And then there's this struggle, this fight to push back that other and to make a place for ourselves and to establish who we are. And then over time, once that's done, we can reintegrate these other pieces. And that's the sort of thing we can get from myth. That's the sort of thing that these myths are talking about and is important for us to understand and look at through that lens and see that we're not alone in doing these things, to see that these are parts of human nature that have been parts of who we are for thousands of years. Okay, so before we can really get into the meat of this though, we have to talk about some of the ways that extra mythology is going to be different from series like Extra History. And one of the key differences is in sources. In mythology, there are a number of different tellings of any of these tales. There is no definitive, absolute version. And you'll notice that sometimes the versions that we tell will be different than perhaps the stories you grew up with. And that doesn't mean they're wrong, right? That doesn't mean the stories that you grew up with are wrong, not at all. It's because sometimes we'll choose one specific version of these tales and talk about that. Sometimes we'll try and bring in disparate elements from many versions of these tales and bring them together the way storytellers have for thousands of years. As part of that, sometimes you'll see things that are moments that you go, wait, what's going on? Or things that seem like discrepancies, holes in these tales, because mythology doesn't always make perfect logical sense. For example, with these Celtic myths, every surviving version of these Celtic myths we have was actually written down by Christian monks. And so you're going to get these moments that are somewhat incongruous where these monks were trying to reconcile the Celtic myths that maybe even they had grown up with the Christian theology and Christian mythology that was really central to their lives. And so you're going to get all these weird things like, take the Dagda. The Dagda is this great example. Is he the god? Is he a god? Is he the strongest of the gods? Is he a dude with a big stick? Yes. I mean, he's kind of all of those things, but part of why he's kind of all of those things is because the Christian monks who were writing these down had a hard time processing a pantheon without the god, right? Or at least the strongest of the gods in the way that they sort of understood Zeus. And they wanted to bring that in to some of the Celtic mythology. And the Dagda was certainly a father god, right? Certainly was a very powerful god. But when you see this confusing stance on who he is, how powerful he is, part of that's just because of where we get it from, right? And that's baked into myth. And we have to understand myth in that sense, in the sense that it is brought to us as a chain of retellings, thought through both its original culture and sometimes through other cultures as well. Which brings us to the origin story in this first Celtic episode. Some of you may have picked up on the fact that I said, some say, but others say. Whenever you hear stuff like that, it's sort of me cluing you in on the fact that there are a lot of very different versions of these stories. And this is usually true, especially when you go really far back to things like origin myths. We'll get very divergent paths. And that whole beginning story with the tree, there's not actually a lot of them that incorporate that. I just heard one version that utilized that, but I really wanted to put it in to demonstrate this sort of difference between the various possible stories. And it's really interesting to me because that version with the tree, if I had to speculate, and I have no real basis for this, but if I had to speculate, that's so similar to some of the Norse myths that I think it was some of these monks, or perhaps even some of the cultures, which, as you may have seen in our Viking expansion episodes of Extra History, some of these Irish groups that were conquered by the Norse, integrating a little bit of that Norse mythology and bringing that into their own myths. And so we're going to get a lot of different variations on the same theme. And some of it's really weird because, for example, is the Dagda the father of all the gods? Is Bridget his daughter, his wife, the other first god? This all radically changes depending on which origin myth you accept. But as you go later on, they sort of all branch into a singular narrative where, you know, what relation people are to others changes over time. But yeah, it's fascinating, but it's one of those examples I wanted you to see of how cultural integration and different tellings of a myth can sort of occur and show us different things. Which brings me to all the hilarious things that, when you really think about myths, are completely batty. Because of all these continuity issues and changes in storyteller and cultural integration things, we get things like in Izanami and Izanagi, right? So where did he get the headdress? And you know, didn't he light his comb on fire? Did he save the teeth? I mean, he does throw the teeth of his comb at somebody else later. I guess he broke the teeth off, was like, I guess I'll need these. Let me burn this comb, right? Total sense. And even in these Celtic ones, right, there's a lot of continuity questions about Silverhand. When exactly does his silver hand get put on? Because most of the tellings of this tale that I read, and these are tellings that go back as far as we have, he's like pulled out of combat, somebody like, they take a sidebar, somebody slapped a silver arm on him, and then he goes back to combat, and everybody treats him as though he doesn't have an arm, right? Like when he gets in that one-on-one duel, and they can't duel because they're not on equal footing because guy has lost his arm. But doesn't he have a cool silver hand instead? So I want to talk about some of that stuff in all these episodes too. But lastly, as I sort of said in the beginning, there's also a takeaway that I always wanted to bring up in this. And I really think in these origin myths, it is about that coming to our sense of self, right? It's that idea that there's struggle involved in establishing who we are and establishing our sense of place and our sense of culture, or in an individual's case, just being. That has to occur. And there's this 3-step process that we see over and over and over in myth. First, there's sort of this self which is not in contact with anything else, right? There's this idea that, we just exist in this plane away from everything, which you see with the Celtic gods in their mythic cities, far away. And then that second, coming into contact with the other, right? They come across to Ireland, and all of a sudden, there are other people already there. There's other things established. And this place where they want to be, this place where they want to make themselves and make for themselves, there's already people occupying. So then it's this violent conflict, right? Then we struggle with the people who are already there. First the Firbolg, and then the Fomorians. And we're wrestling, those are each aspects of their nature, right? That's each aspects of who we are. The Fomorians are our chaotic primal aspects. The Firbolg are sort of our very human rather than our noble godlike aspects. But we wrestle with all these different aspects and all these things outside of us. And when they're finally defeated, we've established who we are at the end of that struggle. And then finally, when that struggle is complete, then we can reintegrate some of those things, right? Some of the Fomorians become part of the pantheon. The Firbolg exist in Ireland. And I think that's an important lesson for all of us to draw. And that's the sort of thing that we can draw from these myths. So that's about it for us. But I just wanted to say thank you again to all the patrons and for all you guys for watching this show, because without you, we couldn't do this. And yeah, join us next week as we talk about Native American myths.
You can also become a patron. I think that's something that we forgot. You have to tell them to become patrons.
Right. So I probably should have done that. Check out the link below to our Patreon page. Please help us out with this. If we get enough, we're going to switch this to being once every week, which would be amazing. And if you're a patron, you get to see the shows early, you get to vote on what cultures we cover, and you get to suggest topics for us to talk about. So yeah, please help. And I guess with that, I think I'm actually done. Join us for Native American Myths.
Yeah, and also smash the like button.
Smash it!
And subscribe.
Smash that button.
Where's Zoe? Is Zoe around?
Zozo!